We've got a couple of more polls that have come out over this past day, taking a look at those important early states of Iowa and New Hampshire. If you're interested in looking at all this data for yourself, we'll have it linked down in the video description. So starting off, going to take a look at Iowa and this Gravis marketing poll where we had 590 registered Democratic voters in the state of Iowa. We have a margin of error of 4 percentage points. Leading the way, Bernie Sanders with just slightly more support in his 19% in relation to Joe Biden, but well within that margin of error. And these continue to be our top two candidates in basically every poll that we see. Now, we have seen Joe Biden recede a bit in recent weeks, and we've also seen Bernie gain a little bit of strength, and there's a lot of reasons for this. I think the main thing with Bernie Sanders is the fact that he has come out and announced that he's running, as well as the fact that he has been campaigning all over the U.S. as well as in those early primary and caucus states. And we have seen his numbers creep up a bit since where we were in the earlier portion of the year. But also we've seen Joe Biden recede a bit, and there's a few reasons I think for this. First and foremost, he just hasn't come out and announced that he's running, and I think his percentage of support is perhaps a little bit more up for grabs amongst those candidates that have announced that they're running, trying to peel off that Joe Biden support. Also, of course, he got some pretty bad press coverage in the earlier portion of the month with people coming out and saying that they felt uncomfortable with how he interacted with them throughout his career. So that was a little bit of a black eye there for Biden that probably reduced his numbers, at least in some sense. And also, I think a big part of perhaps the reduction in Biden numbers is Pete Buttigieg. His surge, he's taking his numbers from somewhere, and I think part of that is coming from that Joe Biden basket of support. So behind Sanders and Biden, we have uncertain here at 16%. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of having uncertain as an option. I'd rather know where these people would be throwing their support if they were to vote today. I'd rather have the question be asked, if you had to vote today, who would you put your support behind, and not have uncertain as an option. But it is in here at 16%, and that's probably the main reason why we see both Sanders and Biden below 20% in Iowa, where typically in these Iowa polls we see Sanders and Biden more in that 20 to 30 range or so. And then behind uncertain, we have Pete Buttigieg continuing to show strength here. He's at 14% of support, and since we have such a loaded field, so many candidates running in this 2020 Democratic presidential primary, people might just be looking for some new young up-and-comer that they like and they want to latch their support onto. And the fact that it's so fragmented here, the fact that Buttigieg is getting a bit of momentum behind his candidacy, he might coalesce some of this other support from candidates like Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker. Maybe people who are supporting those candidates are saying, well, I'd rather support the young up-and-comer that's surging in the polls, so that might even help Pete Buttigieg more so in the coming weeks and months. We'll have to take a look at his numbers, but the fact that he's at 14% of support with still relatively low name recognition in comparison to Biden and Sanders, who are each only around 5 percentage points ahead of him in this poll, I think is a pretty positive sign here for Mayor Pete. And then behind him, we have quite a big gap between his 14% and the rest of the candidates on this list. So at 6%, we have both Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke at 5%, Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar at 4% each, John Delaney at 2%, and then everyone else is at 1 percentage point or less. And I think it's an unfortunate situation for the female candidates that are in this upper group, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. I still think people, maybe even subconsciously, are looking back at 2016 and saw that Hillary Clinton came up short and lost. Perhaps they view female candidates as maybe not being as electable, just given the association to what happened in 2016. And even though Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren are very different from Hillary Clinton in terms of the policies that they have put forward and basically their platform on what they're running on, it's very different than Hillary Clinton. I still think that it might be tough for them to gain the kind of surge in support, at least that we've seen from a candidate like a Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's come out of nowhere, and now he's all the way up at 14%, where candidates like a Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, and even going down a little bit further, like an Amy Klobuchar, haven't been able to do likewise. But then, of course, you could also just say, well, then how do you explain why Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker haven't been able to surge in the polls like Pete Buttigieg? And that's a fair argument as well. There could just be something about Mayor Pete and how effective he is in campaigning and speaking and answering questions that people have latched onto. And it's just been pretty impressive to see what he's been able to do in his surge up in the polls in recent weeks, where all these other candidates have tried to do likewise, and they just haven't been able to do what Buttigieg has done. So now we're going to go over and take a look at that New Hampshire poll, Bernie Sanders, a bit more of a gap between himself and Joe Biden. He's at 30% support here in this University of New Hampshire poll. This was taken, I think the sample size was around 240 to 250. So a relatively large margin of error here, but still a good sign for Bernie Sanders. And you would expect him to do well in the state of New Hampshire. It's the neighboring state to Vermont, where he's a senator from. He's very well known in this part of the country. And I'd say that New Hampshire is a must-win state for Bernie if he's going to go on and win the primary. If he's not doing well in a state like New Hampshire, that doesn't bode well for his candidacy. I'd expect him to do very well in New Hampshire, and that's at least what the poll is indicating at this point. You have Joe Biden 12 points behind him at 18% support, but then again, you have Mayor Pete Buttigieg doing quite well here at 15% of support. This is also a region of the country where Elizabeth Warren is a bit more known, and the fact that she's only at 5% is not a great sign for her. Still a long way to go here where she can perhaps gain some ground, but not looking good for Elizabeth Warren early on. Also, Kamala Harris a bit disappointing here at just 4% of support. You have Cory Booker and Beto O'Rourke at 3%, Klobuchar and Yang, as well as Tim Ryan, all at 2%, and then every other candidate is at 1 percentage point or less. And I just want to scroll down, and let's zoom out a little bit here so we can get all of the data. There we go. You can look at these bar graphs, or this line graph here, and this is the preferred Democratic 2020 presidential nomination, all taken here from the University of New Hampshire. And you can see this orange line is Bernie Sanders, and this yellowish gold line is Joe Biden. So you can see that Biden has seen his numbers reducing. Now it's down to 18%, where Sanders has in general been floating around this mid-20s to 30% range, ticking up here in the most recent poll to 30% support. But then you see this big jump here, and that is, of course, Buttigieg with that huge jump in that result there. So that pretty much is touching on all of the different data that I wanted to talk about in this particular video, looking at the states of Iowa and New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders looking good, leading the way in each poll respectively. And again, you can check out all this polling data down in the video description. Subscribe for more poll analysis in the future, and I hope to see you guys back here for my next video.